Great. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to this book launch event. My name is Christopher Kramer. I'm a professor here in the Department of Development Studies, but we've brought the really big guns this evening, and my main role is just to try and manage time ruthlessly if I can. So I'm going to be very, very brief. It's really lovely, as ever. We've done this a number of times, hosting Guy with his prolific record, and it's lovely to have these kind of urgent, very, very important books that he brings out. I want to tell you what Yanis Varoufakis, just for one person, have said about this book, is that it's a brilliant clarion call to rescue education from individuated, commodified, oligopolized, and financialized training. It's a must-read for those of us who crave a re-education and the disappearing art of educating humans. Right? This stuff matters. This is very, very important. So I'm here as one of two chairs because this is co-hosted by, on the one hand, what I represent, which is the Global Development Seminar Series in the Department of Development Studies here, but we're co-hosting with the Progressive Economy Forum, and my co-chair, colleague Patrick Allen, will say a short word about that, and then we will hand straight over after that to Guy, who barely needs an introduction. I'll introduce the discussants later. Guy has written many, many things. The last thing I did with Guy, we did an hour-and-a-half podcast on the Blue Commons, recorded here, which is another fantastic book. So once you've read this, go and read the Blue Commons if you haven't already. And Guy has, apart from his ILO history and so on, a long association with SOAS, that's really in my department and so on. Patrick, do you want to say a word about the Progressive Economy?
Thank you very much. So, hello everybody, and welcome for this launch of Guy's book. Here's my copy, very well thumbed. My name is Patrick Allen, and I'm the chair and the founder of the Progressive Economy Forum. So I just want to say a quick word about the forum, which was founded by me with help from John Weeks, a professor of economics here at SOAS in 2018. John, also a great friend of Guy's. We created the forum to oppose the policies of austerity introduced by George Osborne in 2010 and to propose macroeconomic policy alternatives. We were inspired particularly by the teachings and policies of Keynes. And to create the policies, we created a council of 20 or so of the best and most eminent economists and other academics. So Guy Standing was one of the first members of the council and has been hugely supportive of the forum ever since. And two of our discussants tonight are also CAF Council members. That's Danny Dorling, Professor of Geography at Oxford, and Kate Pickett, an epidemiologist at York. So it's now 16 years since George Osborne got to work. He committed the macroeconomic sin of cutting spending during a recession to reduce debt. And every serious economist knows that's a mistake, a policy tested to destruction in the 1930s. Cutting spending in a recession causes the economy to spin downwards, accelerated by multiplier effects, and as the economy shrinks, then government revenues shrink and debt goes up. And investors don't invest when the economy looks gloomy. So Cameron Osborne and Osborne's young assistant Rupert Harrison, then 27, knew little or nothing about economics, or didn't really care. They worked on superficial tropes that spending could always be cut and social security spending is too high. So the economy struggled to recover from the 2008 crash, and it still hasn't. The debt did go up, not down. Crucially, our public services in all realms were devastated by cuts, and they've never recovered. Everything you can think of got worse. Inequality went through the roof. Libraries, swimming pools, youth clubs all closed, and we haven't recovered from this era. And austerity was, of course, followed by Brexit and then COVID, so two more shocks to an already weakened economy. So we're in a mess. something has to be done, and that this is where PEF comes in, not just to say that austerity is wrong, but to provide a narrative and an explanation of what's happened and provide alternatives. And countering the notion which says that our public debt is unaffordable and unsustainable, explaining what public debt is for use in public investment and a source of vital income for our pension funds, and how to eliminate inequality and insecurity, and creating industrial and regional policy with the National Investment Bank. So in the last 6 years we have held conferences, delivered lectures, reports, attended the Labour Party conferences, worked with shadow ministers, John McDonnell, discussing tonight, Anne Louise Dodds, Rachel Reeves, and our annual conference is extremely popular, and we're hoping to hold it this year on the 30th of May. So we're in a bad place today with new challenges. Privatisation and outsourcing has led to monopolies and control of crucial parts of the economy, including children's homes and old people's homes. Private equity embeds itself ever deeper, extracting rentier profits even from the education sector, as Guy will explain. Guy cares passionately about the commons in all its aspects, and he's written several groundbreaking books about the dismemberment and sell-on of common rights that we took for granted, like the seabed. So now it's schools, nurseries, colleges, universities, student housing, loans, which provide a stream of rentier profits as private equity gets an iron grip on all aspects of education. You will discover some horrifying facts in this book, which will make your blood boil, and I highly recommend it. And you've heard what Yanis has said about it, so without more ado, over to you, Guy.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. Everybody knows they have an opportunity cost of time, so you to come this evening is a great pleasure for me. Just before the book went to press, my best friend died, and it's dedicated to him. Michael Hopkins. Some of you know him, knew him, and he was a scholar and a loyal friend for 50 years precisely, and I've just come back from scattering his ashes in the Indian Ocean. So it's an emotional moment. I would also like to acknowledge, she's online, Sally Tomlinson, who has been an important influence and an important voice for education for many years in this country, and John Pring, who is no longer with us either, who has been saying similar sort of things for many of his latter period of life. Now, when I was thinking of what to say about the book, I happened to find out a story that the largest university in the United States has just banned the teaching of Plato's Symposium to undergraduate philosophy students. It's got 71,000 students, the AMN Texas University, and they banned Plato. Think what that means. Think what, when you listen, the Americans talk about freedom of speech and freedom of thought and so on, just think what it means. Now, as Patrick's just mentioned, my project over the last 20 years or so has been to revive the ideas of the commons. Throughout our history, ever since, in particular, 1217, and the Charter of the Forest, all the great rebellions of this country have been about defending the commons. And the commons are what belong to all of us as shared commoners. And John will recall that in 2017, he organised an event in the Speaker's Chamber to celebrate the 800th anniversary of the Charter. And I contend that the Charter, along with the Magna Carta, which was sealed the same day, November the 5th, 1217, is the most subversive manifesto in history, certainly in our country. And the Commons embodies values of reproduction over resource depletion and growth. It values a connectedness with nature, and it values a sense of empathy and compassion and social solidarity. And that was the essence of the Athenians in their approach to education in the era of Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle. And the book sort of takes the framework that those ancient Athenians developed as a starting point in defining what was pretty close to being an education commons. And for them, education was about paideia, the search for truth, and philosophia, a love for the searching of truth and unattained wisdom. Along with that reverence for the search for truth was a reverence for arete, moral excellence, moral virtue. And these two pillars of education for the ancient Athenians defined what they felt education should be all about. And for that to take place, they recognized the need for what we call Socratic dialogue, a constant questioning, a probing of equals with principles of isagoria, the equal right to speak and the equal duty to hear. The latter part is very important because it rarely gets mentioned. And alongside isagoria was a very important notion, and I've tried to develop it in a recent article, parrhesia. And parrhesia is the ability to speak truth to power, the ability to speak out frankly, truthfully, without fear of retribution. Then the responses to Trump in the last year, there's been a complete absence of parrhesia by too many people. And we need to strengthen parrhesia. Now, for the ancient Athenians, of course, education took place in the open, in the agora. And in the agora, that was where Plato established his first academy in a 2-acre spot in Athens, which lasted 473 years as an academy for dialogue and education and pursuit of truth. Now this ethos is developed in the appendix and in chapter 2 of the book, but chapter 1 is entitled The Horror. All of you who've read Heart of Darkness, Conrad, and the scene Apocalypse Now will recognize that term. And I think the term the horror applies to what's been happening to education, particularly in the last 50 years. I'll mention a few stylized facts. I won't go into many of them because we don't have time and I don't want to upset you too much. But essentially we've seen an intensification of schooling in my lifetime. More hours a day in school, more weeks a year, starting at earlier age, and it starts a treadmill. All the way through life, you're meant to be doing more and more lifelong learning courses. All new. There are even courses in adulting and aging, even to the point of preparing for death. All sorts of courses that are made up of a commercialized interests. And one of the first victims of this trend has been a great shrinking of play. And I cite the example of the most expensive academy school built in Peterborough for £46 million, and the headmaster of this new grand school was interviewed, and he said, well, we don't have a playground, we don't need a playground, we want efficiency. They can play out elsewhere. We don't need a playground. No playground. I think that statement qualified him for instant dismissal. Unfortunately, others didn't. But we have a shrinking of play, and I give various statistics, and government policies have certainly contributed to that. And John, I hope you will take into your opposition to your wonderful government that currently Wes Streeting is considering cutting all funding for physical education in secondary schools. A remarkable state of affairs. But we have a shift to human capital, which took place in the 1970s and influenced Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph to a great extent. And it was representing the new neoliberal economics revolution of that period. And human capital is basically, in a Marxian terminology, is about embodied labor power. It's about equipping people to be more competitive, to become better than others. It's about turning a public good, education, into a private good, a source of inequality rather than a source of sharing. And we see that also going through lifetime training courses in what's called continuous professional development courses that many of the leading occupations have to take, which I call dominated by infomercials and so on. Another stylized fact that has come in is that we are suffering from a peculiar pandemic. It's called in my book examinitis. People from a very early age are having to take more and more exams. More and more exams. And to the extent that I give statistics, where about a quarter of all time in many schools and in some universities is spent taking tests. Taking tests. You're either a failure or a success. A failure or a success. And this examinitis has contributed to a remarkable finding, which is that 1 in every 4 teenagers leaves school hating learning, openly saying they hate it. That's not a healthy situation. Along with that, we have a collapse of deep reading. Now, I'm sure the following statistic does not apply to SOAS. Now, I know it doesn't apply to SOAS. But it turns out that 49% of all students at universities, on average, don't read books unless they are absolutely forced to do so. Think what that means with your education. Again, I say it doesn't happen at SOAS, but it happens statistically in many other places. And we have a situation where in the United States, which has more years of schooling than any other country in history, 54% of adults have a learning capacity under the age of 12. Think what that means if you've got an education system. What's it doing? And alongside that, another horrifying situation, as I show in a later chapter on the precariat in schooling, we have a real problem of teacher burnout. Huge number of teachers leaving in despair, suffering from mental breakdowns, and so on. And then in British universities, another stylized fact, British universities, on average, 1 in 4 are operating food banks for their students because they're suffering from food insecurity and income insecurity. I could give you quite a few other statistics from that chapter, but I think you've got enough there to see that we have a serious crisis, if the overused crisis is appropriate, in our education system. There's a section in that chapter which I call the AI paradox. I'm sure you're all familiar with the singularity hypothesis that AI is gradually approaching the point where it's equal to HI, human intelligence. I think it's doing the opposite. I think as AI goes up, HI goes down. And I give reasonings for thinking that, and since the book was finished, I think the evidence is piling up. It's reducing human intelligence, creativity, and most importantly, it's reducing empathy. Empathy is being able to put yourself in the shoes of the other and to be able to identify with their predicaments. It's a vital part of education and the commons throughout history, and yet we have people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump saying openly there should be a war against empathy. That is a peculiar situation. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, I'm going to skip in the sense that it's about the nature of the education commons, which I hope students will find of interest more than the general reader, although my commissioning editor in Penguin told me several times it's her favourite chapter, so tell Hannah that I mentioned that. But the rest of the book traces the tragedy of the education commons as a process by which we have lost our sense of an education as a public good and a source of empathy and social solidarity. It began with enclosure. Enclosure, every commons has suffered from enclosure. That means when the state takes control, as usually as a precursor to the next stage, which is privatization. Most of Margaret Thatcher's reforms were about enclosure. Her 1988 Education Act was imposing a very narrow, strict, instrumental curricula on schools. Deleting, she wanted to delete all arts and humanities from schools altogether, the curriculum. She was persuaded that that was a little bit too far, but basically marginalizing them was the next best step for her. And Gove, of course, took that on as the great modern encloser, as I call him, and he removed, say, the teaching of the history of colonialism and empire from compulsory teaching on the grounds that he didn't want us to see people suffering from post-colonial trauma and guilt. So you distort history as part of your teaching system. Now, examinitis that I mentioned earlier is very much part of the enclosure. But the point I want to make about that chapter is what happened to universities. Universities traditionally, under the influence of people like John Stuart Mill, Alexander von Humboldt, Cardinal Newman in the 19th century, was seen as a source of liberation. It was elitist, we know that, but essentially the intention was to encourage people how to think and how to be critical, how to hear all sides of arguments. And this reached its epitome in this country in 1963 with the Robbins Report. And the Robbins Report essentially said that the essential aim of a degree should be to teach people how to think. And it said we should deplore any artificial stimulus to research and avoid commercialization. That was the last hurrah of the liberal traditions of universities in this country. Because by the time of the Jarrett Report that Thatcher commissioned in 1985, they stated, and it was the commission, the report had a committee from the finance industry, from the arms industry, and from tech, but nobody from schooling or education. And it reached the conclusion that universities are first and foremost corporate enterprises to be run by financial experts. It's a fundamental change in those two reports. And since then, as I trace in this chapter, there's been a huge collapse in the teaching and learning of the humanities, of history, of culture, of art. It's a story in itself. The next chapter is the next phase of the process of privatization of education. And it starts with the nurseries. They've all been privatized because local councils have had their funds cut and so on. There's no evaluation that's been taking place of whether this is an advantage for children or parents. And it goes on through what I call the privatization of schools by stealth, which is, first of all, by cutting funding for state schools. But the biggest thing, of course, was the emergence of so-called academies and free schools, which was basically a new Labour invention of Blair. It began in 2002, but essentially when Michael Gove became the Secretary of State for Education, he said, I'm going to put a rocket booster under academies. What academies are, it's a quasi-privatization of state schools, turning over ownership and control to private commercial interests. The only partial evaluation was done by a House of Commons committee, and it found that there was no evidence that this resulted in any improvement in the quality of schooling. But there's not been a proper evaluation. But today there are over 11,000 academy chains and about 800 free schools run by commercial interests. And one of the biggest chains is run by a man in London who boasts he's never read a book. Never read a book. Well, okay, that's his choice. But to have your schools with thousands of children run by a chain, run by people who are not into books, is a strange situation. A number of other cases that I mentioned, and I give evidence and data, somehow the money that goes into it ends up in the bank accounts of the owners of the chains. I don't know how it happens. You know, it's sort of a great tendency. So what is happening in that process is that more and more of the money that is going into schooling is actually not going into schooling. You can work it out, and the evidence is pretty clear. The biggest thing, I think, which I've just mentioned in this chapter, is the growth of international school chains, where, as I show in later chapter, you have international school chains covering thousands and thousands of children in various countries, run by an owner of a chain of schools. Remarkable development which hasn't received enough attention. The next chapter, it deals with commodification. Commodification, when it comes, everything is for sale. Buying and selling. And this affects degrees. Degrees are commodities. You can get degrees that are credentials that get you access to jobs. And because AI is destroying entry-level jobs, you're not going to get a very good return, so you have to go further and get a master's degree rather than an undergraduate degree. And we have a situation that is unique in history, where you need a greater qualification to get a job that doesn't require that qualification. This is a unique historical development. I see several students smiling because we know the reality. So we have schools as commodities, bought and sold, transferred, going bankrupt, then transferred, huge numbers of students suddenly finding that they don't have a school. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. And as universities, we have a situation, because universities have to be competitive with other universities, an increasing amount of the resources spent by universities, and I'm sure Chris will recognize this, is spent on what's called fighting competition. In other words, going out and trying to recruit more than your competitor. So a greater and greater amount of the spending of a university is not spent on tuition, it's not spent on giving faculty members decent salaries and pensions and blah, blah, blah. It's spent on recruitment offices in Beijing or in anywhere else in the world. And of course, a lot of profit is made, a lot of profit. So we have a situation where universities are flourishing commercial but diminishing education. The next thing, which I just cite with reference because he's an esteemed member of John McDonnell's party still, is that there's a spread of think tanks. Think tanks which are so-called think tanks, but they're ideological and often funded by plutocrats of the extreme right. But easily the most well-funded think tank in this country is the Tony Blair Institute. And the Tony Blair Institute has over 1,000 employees, including some senior members who are paid over £1 million a year. And Tony Blair and his institute has received a little matter of £257 million from Larry Ellison, close friend and mentor of a certain Donald Trump. It has enormous political power, enormous power to feed misinformation, feed selective information into the system, and doesn't get enough attention. But, have no fear, his son is doing almost as well. Because Ewan Blair came up with the wheeze of setting himself up through his company Metaverse as an education broker. What that means is he is supplying apprentices to companies who are using the apprentice levy from the government to pay Ewan Blair for the service. Notice, Ewan Blair doesn't do a single day's education. He doesn't. He just puts in contact. Cheap labour, because they're paid as apprenticeship, but they're not really getting 2 days a week or 1 day a week. Anyhow, in 2022, he mobilised £1.7 billion in 1 day. More than all universities in this country. He mobilised that money. And in 2022, it was allowed by the government to issue BSc degrees, apprenticeship degrees. I don't know what value is being added by his company, but certainly the Queen seemed to have appreciated it because he was awarded the MBE for services to education. Now, every member of this panel has done more services for education than he has ever liked to do. But something fishy is going on. So that's enough of that chapter because I want to just briefly mention what I think is the pithy core of the book. In a commons, you see enclosure, privatisation, modification, and that prepares the ground for financialisation. And what has happened to the world of education is that private equity has taken control of every layer of what we call education, from preschool all the way through the MOOCs, the ed tech, the universities. And private equity is when the very wealthy lend money to a fund. The fund has a duty to its investors to achieve short-term profit maximization. They buy up colleges, schools, school chains, whatever you want, any part of the system. And they have two strategies. The first strategy is called buy, strip, and flip. And what this means in old-fashioned terms is something close to asset stripping. What they do is they buy up, say, a college or something like that, and then they indulge in what's called leaseback agreements. They sell a building, or they sell the ground, and then they rent back. Meanwhile, they've sold the profits they got from the sale of their own property goes to their investors, and they incur debt for themselves, to the fund and their owners, the immediate owners. They then have a tendency to go bankrupt because they can't pay their debts. And I give lots of examples of this practice, which is basically ruining the fundamentals of our historical inheritance of education institutions and much else. But they have another policy as well, an alternative sometimes, and sometimes at the same time. It's called roll-up. What they do is they buy up all local suppliers they can in order to be able to charge monopolistic prices without fear of losing the markets to competitors. And if you take, for example, you take SEND schools, which are for disabled children. They've been buying up, and with SEND schools and with preschools and with primaries, they're charging local authorities who have been denied the resources to have their own facilities. So you get the average cost now of a financialized, private equity-owned primary schooling, SEND schooling as well, is £62,000 a year per pupil. The local authorities, when they supply, and they've still got it, are charging about £28,000. So you can see basically they're extracting surplus at an incredible rate.
Just 5 minutes?
Yeah, exactly. I go through all the areas of financialization, and I just want to give a classic example of the biggest university in the world, as it was for a while. Most people don't know it, but it's called the Phoenix University. At one time, it had 600,000 students with a huge number of campuses, which I document. And it was founded by a remarkable man called John Sperling, who inadvertently said, in a moment of hubristic pride, "We are not trying to develop students' value systems or go in for that expand their minds bullshit." He was called the Henry Ford of higher education, and he adopted Tayloristic methods. And unfortunately, the private equity company that's dominating Phoenix University has essentially gone fraudulent, and it's collapsed. So today, there are hardly any students in the Phoenix universities because they're practically defunct. Studies have shown that where private equity takes over colleges, staff costs go down because salaries go down, lower spending on actual education, and worse results in terms of performance of learning. That's the reality. But something happened in July last year that didn't get much attention. A right-wing Bolivian billionaire with friends in Wall Street effectively bought up Britain's fastest-growing university, Arden University, with 44,000 students. A billionaire, well, I don't care whether he comes from Bolivia or anywhere, buys up a British university and has the capacity to impose the curriculum they want to impose. I think a British university should be run by the British public and the community of education in this country. It's nothing reformist about that. It's about your culture and about reproduction. Because when you allow plutocrats and financiers, private equity companies in Wall Street buy up your schooling, you create the possibility that the next thing they do is alter the curricula to suit their particular ideology. Elon Musk is buying up a lot. He's even established his own university. He's spending a lot. I don't want his politics determining the education outcomes or practices for our children and our grandchildren. If you do, then fair enough. But that is what is happening to the financialization process. The next chapter, which I'm not going to discuss because I'm running out of time, as Chris correctly reminds me, is about how the precariat has developed inside schooling. I'll give you one statistic. There are now over 70,000 supply teachers supplied through brokers to schools who are receiving 40% of the wage of regular staff, and yet the private equity companies that are dominating are charging local councils and local schools double the wage that those supply teachers are getting. Finally, not finally, but I will make it final, I suppose. Chapter 8. I recommended Chris when I asked him to do this event. I said, just read chapter 8 because your blood pressure will go up and you'll play better tennis afterwards. Chapter 8 is called The Ultimate Horror, Caligula on the Potomac. And it shows how Trump, Vance, Musk, and their colleagues are openly declaring a war on education. Openly. They've got lots of quotations. They say, our enemy is the universities. We have to strike at the heart of the beast. That's Vance. There's a crusade, and there's a crusade also of religification. It's racism, it's eugenics coming back, a great replacement theory, some of you may be familiar. The ugliness of what they're doing and the speed at which they're doing it is what I call the ultimate horror. Now the final chapter is one I hope some of you will still be interested in reading. It is what is to be done. And one of the things that I say in that chapter is that we must make progress by negating the negation. Definancialize school, decommodify schooling, decommodify, restore the values of schooling and education. Return and revive a commons mentality and a commons mutualization of governance so that parents, children, students and faculty are in control. Wow, what a radical idea. And I offer this to John and what remains of this government, whatever it tries to do. We should have a national commission on education as a matter of urgency to reverse the trends which are turning the education into literally an enemy of us, the commons. It can be done, but it means we have to recognize the depth of disgust that's taking place. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much, Guy. There's at least one person in the audience who can confirm the effect of chapter 8 on my but before I do a very, very brief kind of batch introduction to our very distinguished discussants, I just want to remind everybody that we welcome you to the reception afterwards in the cloisters of the Paul Webley building, which is the Senate House, about 25 metres next to this building. And on your way out, I believe you can buy at an amazing discount Guy's wonderful book if you don't already have it. But we have our three speakers, and I'm going to tell you about all of them and then ask them one by one to speak very briefly. And the first is John McDonnell, and we were worried that John might not be able to make it if there was an emergency from the Parliament, but we're really thrilled that John could join us. John is the MP since '97, I think, for Hayes and Harlington, and so most of you would perhaps be better known as acting as the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer between 2015 and 2020, but has a long and rich career before that as an official in the National Union of Mine Workers, and working for the TUC, and the Canada Council, and the Association of London Authorities, and so on and so forth. Very, very distinguished and forthright politician in this country with the courage of his convictions, which is too rare these days. We're also joined, and really lucky to be joined by Kate Pickett, who's Professor of Epidemiology at the University of York, who's worked in a number of other places as well. Kate focuses in her work on the determinants of health and inequalities in well-being. And I hope some of you have read her very, very brilliant and well-known book that she wrote with Richard Wilkinson, The Spirit Level, but also The Inner Level, some time back. Fantastic. But more recently, she has published The Good Society. And then finally, we will hear from Danny Dorling, who's a professor in the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford. And previously worked in Sheffield and Leeds and elsewhere. His latest book last year, is it still The Next Crisis? It was called The Next Crisis, but maybe there's one next crisis coming soon. But before that, amongst other publications, he wrote a few years back with Annika Koljonen, a very interesting thing called Fintopia, which is what we can learn from the world's happiest country, which has quite a lot to do with their education system. So, can I ask you one after the other, and very briefly, John, if you would speak, either come up or speak from there.
I'll do from here, that's okay. Very briefly.
Want some light? Harben? Thank you.
What's admirable about Guy's work is that he's systematically applying the concept of the common to our society and our economy. Shall I use? Okay, let me come clear. But maybe it's better going up there.
Yeah. Or if you need the roving one.
No, it's better to go.
What's I think it's important about Guy's work, and we go back a number of years. Guy was one of my advisors when I was the Shadow Chancellor, so he's to blame mainly. What he's done systematically is apply the principles of the commons to different sections of our society and economy overall, and the appendix of the book will set out the principles of the commons itself. In fact, as he said, on one time, we did hold an event in the Speaker's House, but we also went to Lincoln and held a conference there to find the charter of the forest that was there, because that was where it was located. And he took us through and gave us an appreciation of what the commons meant. This concept of just common ownership and control of not just the assets, but the decision making, the idea of development, etc. And God help us if there's anything we need at the moment is that concept of really having a shared understanding of the world and a shared belief that the world can be bettered, and a shared understanding that actually we can take control of our lives again. I think we're at the most politically dangerous moment, certainly in my life, with what we've seen in terms of the rise of Trump, the rise of the right wing, and the rise of nationalism and racism within our own society as well. And I think that's a reflection of what Guy has identified within the book, which is the erosion of our educational system, the negation of basically the ability to think and challenge, because the concept, as he describes in his book, of human capital, turns education into a mechanistic process of just producing, effectively, worker fodder for the economy that's being designed. And what most of us thought, as well as socialists, we thought if we could attain government, establish an education system which was truly democratically controlled, which reflected those values, largely of the Enlightenment, we thought what would happen is that then people would be sufficiently educated to understand how our economy works, how our society is run, and as a result of that, they would bring about a progressive development of society on behalf of us all. And it was built in, as he says in the book, that building in of empathy. But what we've seen I've been in politics now for 50 years, what Guy has mapped out is both within our economy overall, where he talks about the financialisation, but also with regard to the way in which our economy now has become a rentier economy, how that's infected every aspect of our life, and education in particular. And I just give my own examples, really, in my own constituency. Guy places a lot of emphasis on play. Our play association is gone now. We have 9 staff, we've got 1. Our playgrounds are no longer invested in. Our open spaces are being sold off for high-rise developments, so largely to private capital. In terms of one of the aspects of actually getting the Blair government that I supported wholeheartedly was the development of local children's partnerships. I chaired mine, and we set up Sure Start centres. Sure Start was a great initiative. Virtually all of them are now shut. We trained childminds. We had hubs where we could introduce best practice, all wiped off the face of the earth. Most of my schools in my constituency are academies. And we've got now multiple academies, the multiple academy trusts, in which they've recreated a sort of mini education system, but largely for the benefit of those boards of directors. The average pay on those is anything between 150 and 250,000 pounds. I had the first PFI imposed upon one of my schools in my constituency. It was imposed by Alan Milburn when he was the Treasury Secretary. He's now been brought back to advise the government on the future of young people and employment. We paid off the PFA last year. 2 years ago, I had to go to a Conservative minister to get the last £1 million to pay it off. At one point in time, it was with Jarvis. We were thinking of occupying the school because Jarvis was in a financial crisis. We thought they were going to strip us of the assets within the school itself. Then I have a large number of young people who are now done everything asked of them in terms of staying at school, getting their education, and well, gone on to university. And now they're loaded with anything between £50,000 and £90,000 worth of debt. No way it's going to be paid off. £360 billion worth of debt. No way that'll be paid off. In fact, even Tory governments have been writing sections of it as well. And the argument there, and I voted against tuition fees, the argument there was the one that's inherent in Guy's book, is that education is a gift from one generation to another. It's not a commodity to be bought and sold. And we're at a crisis, I think, across our society certainly, where the educational system has been so mechanistic, it's so dulled the opportunities for thought and debate and challenge, that as a result of the economic circumstances that we're now in, the levels of poverty that we now have, people have not only been unable to fully understand the implications of what's happened to them, but also have been unable to then formulate the ways in which it can be challenged. And as a result of that, it lays themselves open to populist politicians who will come along, scapegoat a particular group, and as a result of that, we're seeing the rise of a form of authoritarianism that, what I like is, Guy quotes Lasky a lot of times in his work. Lasky is one of those figures I think that completely underappreciated, because what Lasky said, he was the chair of the Labour Party after the Second World War. He said at that point in time, don't expect fascism in this country to come from some general with marching up and down with medals on his chest. It's more likely to be an erosion of our civil liberties, an incremental attack on our human rights, and that will result in an authoritarian regime. And that's what we're seeing. So this undermining of basic educational standards of debate, challenge, discussion, and empathy is resulting, as a result of our economic crisis that is inherent within our economic system, is resulting in, I think, the most dangerous political moment of my life. That's why the book, and I'll finish on this point, that's why the book is so important, really. What it does, it contextualises what's happened to education within the economic system overall, but also it sets out in detail the erosion of those basic values that we thought we were building to be inherent within our system, and where it's now landed us. And it's landed us, I think, in a crisis. The government at the moment, I can't speak for the government, but the government in a number of areas on the educational front, I think, is trying to do its best within the resources it has. But I think it's going to have to face up to the crises that they face in higher education. There's about 3,000 staff being laid off at the moment. tuition fees now have completely failed, so the funding of higher education in crisis. It's the same in FE as well. The academies are failing in terms of both financially but also in management, and as Guy said, they've replicated the abuse and the exploitation of staff as well. So you have now a very radicalisation of the trade unions within that sector who are having to take action to defend their members. And at the same time, I think the reality that's come to the government is that you just cannot rely upon the private sector to deliver. And as a result of that, there is, I think, a growing awareness within government, and it's including within the discussions around SEND, the way exactly as Guy set out, the way the private equity has exploited the state in terms of the prices it charges for SEND schools and other provisions. I think the government now is beginning to recognise the crisis that there is across the piece, and at the same time realise that the only solution is to actually greater state involvement, and yes, to fund that a redistribution of wealth. So I think Guy's book will contribute towards that discussion. I agree with the idea of setting up a commission of inquiry, a proper discussion that debate's on, and that will be one of the arguments that we'll be putting to Bishop Phillipson and others, that now's the time to have a more fundamental debate, because this crisis is about to hit this government on one of the policy areas it was elected to actually address significantly.
Thank you.
First, I want to say thank you, Guy, for inviting me to take part in this, which gave me the opportunity to read your magisterial book, actually cover to cover, and it is an amazingly comprehensive look at a really serious problem. Not just facing our country, but perhaps particularly problematic in the UK for all kinds of contemporary and historical reasons. I find, Guy, that often I'm coming at the same problem as you from my perspective as an epidemiologist, and you're coming at the same problem from your perspective as a political economist, and we converge in a space where we actually agree about the fundamental problems of an issue. And I think how I characterise that perspective as an epidemiologist is that I bring a methodology that's about comparing what's happening to groups of people, outcomes for people, that there's a focus on well-being, if we take that more broadly than just health, but also always a deep focus on inequalities and injustice. And I think if you look at our educational system as a whole, and you start to think about who is it working for, who is it failing, what are the problems within it, it starts to look like an edifice that cannot stand for much longer as it is, because it's failing so many people. The school day doesn't work for working parents. There's a post-coda lottery for if you've got special educational needs or disabilities. The admission system favours the rich. The school year doesn't work for anybody who's struggling educationally, because that long break in the summer fails people. We've got an inspection system that's opposed by teachers and the teachers' union. And we've got a tuition fees barrier to inclusion and diversity in our universities. Everywhere you look, there are problems. But in my comments, because I do want to keep them brief, I just want to focus on two things. And one is the cost to children. And in this, I've been hugely influenced by the work of Laura Quick, who's at the Institute for Education at UCL, and her recent book, Bottom of the Class, results from her qualitative and ethnographic research with children who are viewed as educational failures in primary school. And it's incredibly moving and heartbreaking to read the lived experiences of those children who are regarded at the ages of 5, of 6, of 7, of 8 as failures, because they are not easily attaining the exam results that the schooling system demands of them. And nobody cares about their other good qualities. Nobody cares that they're particularly good at friendship, or looking after their pet at home, or looking after their parents, or being creative, or being good at play with other children. And they are made to feel that they will be lifelong failures in this system. How can we have allowed this to happen in our schools? How can we have failed with our teacher training so that we still get teachers shouting at children and reading out their marks to the rest of the class and not understanding the psychological damage they're doing? And if we look at educational outcomes for children and young people in this country, it is the poor who suffer most. It is those living in deprived areas. It is those from disadvantaged and excluded communities. It is the vulnerable. And if you have a system that does not serve the vulnerable as well as the most privileged, then you need to dismantle it completely, I think, and start again. And so the other thing I want to mention is private education and its role within our educational system. 7% of children in the United Kingdom are in private schools, but 30% of Oxbridge undergraduates went to a private school. And Aaron Reeves and Sam Friedman, in their recent book, there at the LSE, they looked at the likelihood that those in the most privileged positions in society managed, if they were born into the top 1%, did they manage to stay in the top 1% by the time they were adults? And there'd been absolutely no change in that percentage who managed to stay in the top from the 1890s until now. And our private education system is an engine of inequality. And inequality, we know from all our work together, Richard, is damaging to society, to individuals, to our economy, to our environment, and yet we allow this educational system that perpetuates and entrenches that inequality from generation to generation. And private schools are state subsidised, so we're helping them out. Private schools are taking away parental support and encouragement that could belong in a wider public sector. So parent support is being enclosed in the private sector. And as an engine of inequality, private education, I think, is simply indefensible. I think your perspective about looking at education as a commons helps us to really think about the suffering that is induced by our educational system as it has become enclosed and commodified and financialised. And I think it helps us see where we need to go. And I was struck that in your last chapter, when you are talking about solutions, you do recognise that we must solve the problems of poverty and inequality if we're going to have a chance of fixing our education system. So I'll end just by saying that there is a movement within schools called poverty proofing, and it's good. Schools are doing everything they can to make sure that poor children have equal resources within their school, equal opportunities within their school. But we shouldn't be poverty-proofing our schools. We should be poverty-proofing our society. And we should be tackling the inequality that has created all of the problems that we're here to discuss tonight. So thank you, Guy, for your book. I've digested it, and I need to sort of, I think, reflect on it a lot more. But I think it's a real beacon for all of us who are interested in creating a better society. Thanks.
Thank you.
You're probably wondering why you've got a geographer talking about an education book. I'm Danny Dorling, and I think I was asked to write a blurb for Guy's book, and I wrote something like most exciting book on education in the last 40 years of those I've read. It really is a page turner, not least for the scandal after scandal that Guy's unearthed. So why geography? Because it gives you optimism. It's one of the ways out of this conundrum. This is very much mainly a book about the UK and the USA, much less about other countries, because almost nowhere else in the affluent world has been as stupid as us. They really haven't. We have the highest tuition fees, that's in the United States. They just disappear elsewhere. Absolutely minimal. Everybody in the world, no matter what country they're in, complains about their country and complains about their education system and their health service and so on. We always moan. But when you compare them, you can see these enormous differences. And it means that you're not talking about what is theoretically possible. It is about what is actually happening. Now, you mentioned that I wrote with Anika a book on Finland. Finland, you're probably aware, is one of the countries in Europe which does very well in education. But almost all countries in Europe do better in education when we actually compare something like people's ability at age 24 across Europe, which we don't like doing. British universities do not want their students being tested on what they can actually do, because they're all excellent and brilliant, and they're all geniuses. Because if you pay over £9,000 a year for your degree, that's what you get. The minute you pay, it stops being education. The minute you pay, nobody fails. The minute you pay, the job is to convince you that you're getting something, and convince your parents and others. But as long as nobody finds out, it doesn't actually matter if you can't code and need to use ChatGPT, which, by the way, can't write code for you that works. It doesn't matter if you can only speak one language and only write in one. It doesn't matter if you don't actually read books, because you're paying. Once you take the money out, the whole thing is fairly pointless if people don't actually learn something and don't think. And you can see this by going to other countries and watching what happens in other places. Optimism. So I'll just give you a couple of things to be optimistic about. We have more teachers per pupil, more classrooms per pupil, more playing fields than anywhere else in Europe. We've got it all. You can have a situation where 200 roofs of school buildings are so dangerous you couldn't put a child under them, which we actually have, and easily reallocate children to other buildings because we have so many. We have dedicated more space to education than any other country. But as Kate pointed out, this is our 7% of private schools that mean we've done this, which spend 30% of the total money on education. In my city in Oxford, about a third of the children go private by about age 15. In London, it's only 20%. But the vast majority of this space dedicated to education is in those private schools, including a 9-hole golf course within the ring road of the most expensive city this side of San Francisco, so that 13-year-olds can learn to play golf. It's not education, it's not PE, it doesn't make you that fit playing golf. So there will come a time, inevitably, where we cannot afford to keep on doing this anymore. And by the way, in the old days, if I had been sent to a private school, I'd been 20 times more likely to go to university than going to a state school. 20 times. Now the difference is minimal. It's only fear. It's only fear. You're not buying your children a better chance in life. Yes, everybody in Who's Who has a relative in Who's Who and the 1%, but the vast majority of people in the top 1 or 2% fail. They don't actually make a lot of money. They drop down. So our education system is not good. Just one more to keep the time. University fees. You remember we introduced them at £1,000 and then £3,000, and then a minister created a commission, I think run by Lord Brown, passed over to another government and got them over £9,000, and now they're higher. At the time these fees were brought in, there was a deafening silence about what was wrong with them. People were told that, they made sense, that it was fair, that the working class shouldn't be paying for other people to go to university. 2/3 of people go to university by age 30. 2/3. but only if it's further people not going. The minister, who in 2010 set up the mechanism whereby by 2012 we have £9,000 a year, the minister was Peter Mandelson. Right, you have to remember that every time you talk about fees, remember Peter Mandelson's idea. In the last 2 weeks, it has become evident, what we worked on in PEF in 2018 and 19, that the fee is not a good deal. RPI plus 3% for 30 years is going to take an enormous amount of money from you, that you can see. Or if you're on the plan, which is 40 years, it's slightly less but for longer. It doesn't work, but where's the money really going to come from? Now, the people who are paying the fees in this room might be annoyed about this, but you're not the ultimate people who are going to lose out, because you've gone to university, you'll be middle class or upper middle class, and what you normally do is you buy one of the houses that one of the older people in the room is hoping to sell in a few years' time with a mortgage. But you're not going to be able to buy a house at the price that the older people in the room think their house is going to sell for, because we've taken the money out. The whole system doesn't work. It's a Ponzi scheme. It will end. It ends with the merging of universities, the bankruptcy, the closure of them, schools becoming financially unviable, local authorities within 2 or 3 years being unable to cover their budgets because of SEND. The only question is, how is it going to end? Not that it will end, but how does it end? And do we end it with a plan to end it, or do we just end it in chaos? One last thing that gives me optimism is we've managed to politicise an entire generation. 66% of people who go to university, 66% by age 30, 15 by age 80. 90% of you will have a debt you'll be paying back the rest of your life. 10% of you won't, because your parents pay the fees. You never talk about this, but this is inherently unfair, and we've done it to the middle class. If you are trying to make the top half of society angry about the situation you are in, I can't think of a better way to make people realise that politics actually matters and equality matters than every month showing them how much money you're taking away from them because they made the mistake of not being born in Scotland. You're going to get this eventually. We do need optimism to get out of this, and we do need to take the money back which has been stolen, and we need to use the resources that we have well. And the question is, if we think we can do it for things like water and sewage at some point, that we're not paying people to poison our rivers and poison the water we drink, this is the same but almost more insidious over where they think they can take the money from. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we might need the lights back on because we have got a little bit of time for some...